A rural setting and an awesome soundtrack.
Did anyone listen to the Hai Lung
No.
YouTube link? Man, it's great.
Sure
All that throat singing that you hear in Midsummer is like traditional kind of throat singing from like Scandinavia. And Hai Lung basically do kind of like modernized. Okay, cool. The YouTube link is YouTubing. Cool. Okay, it's going to show us in the corner, but it's just going to be looping the sweet ass video, I hope.
The video isn't playing on my end. It's got a good freeze frame on what is happening.
Ooh, okay.
I'm
sorry we didn't get the red wine to you in time.
I mean, it's way too early for me to start drinking. That's all right. I'll have it later.
Way too early. Automatically loop. Okay. Cool. I mean, we're live now. I just have an updated link tree.
Cool.
So, be careful with what you say.
Always am.
All right. Okay. And now for Linktree. So everyone who's kind of like subtly, who's gotten their notification on their phone will be like, oh, cool.
All right.
We're getting more. You'd think after 6 episodes would be more efficient.
The live is quite stressful, actually.
Also, that Zoom doesn't allow you to like get the YouTube link without broadcasting.
Right. Okay.
There might be a way to do it. I just don't know what that is.
Well, the fact that more professional podcasts than us have yet to master it.
You mean podcasts with staff? Okay. That should be working now.
I think it is. Crob's listening to us anyway.
Yeah, if you subscribe, you'll get the notification that's saying that we're live.
And you guys edit this together after?
Yeah, we do. So, but we leave the live stream. If the live stream's good, it's good.
Yeah.
Chris says the links are live. So
cool. It really isn't looping, is it? I thought this video was loopy. Okay, cool. No, it's just because I was
in press play.
Okay, what happened is because PowerPoint was in the background, it paused the video. And so I'm doing all the other stuff, putting the PowerPoint presentation on, thinking it's...
Have you pressed record on GarageTree? GarageBand.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I'm going to switch off the thing, and I completely forgot about GarageBand. So
another minute.
No, another minute. I got to open. I'm just going to be saving in the Joker file.
Fair enough.
All right. Now we're good. Can't believe you just said that, Stu. Said what? No, I'm
too far gone, Stu.
I am way too. It's like first thing in the afternoon. I can still taste the toothpaste. It's awful.
Yeah,
it's way too.
Smell the smoothie and taste the toothpaste. Do you want to start or shall I?
I think you just volunteered.
Okay. Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher,
and I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where, and in this case, a live stream where we have 2 aspiring Australian filmmakers and 1 successful Australian filmmaker.
Successful, quite right there.
Trying to work out what makes great screenplays work.
Yes, we are joined by a previous guest who we described as the most successful screenwriter that we know. But now that I've hung out with like Shane Black and like Facebook friends with him, that's no longer the case, Catherine, but you're still pretty successful. Because when we spoke to you, I think The Other Lamb was on the blacklist, but it hadn't yet even been in production. I can't remember. That was Blade Runner.
Yeah, no, it hadn't been. It was, I remember very clearly because I was in Canada, so I can pinpoint when it was, which was like start of 2017, I think. So it hadn't been shot.
And given that I have not...
It came out in TIFF, premiered at TIFF 2019, and I think it's coming out VOD now-ish?
It's out in America, Canada. I think it's coming out in the UK in July. It's out in a few European countries where it's kind of sold, I think mostly to Europe, to most of Europe, but kind of, they each have different distributors. So yeah, it's kind of slowly rolling out. It's interesting. I don't know how it would have gone without COVID. Obviously you can't predict that, but might have been better in some ways, worse in others. So yeah, it's a weird time to be releasing a film, but I'm glad we had finished shooting, because a few friends have had films that either were in the middle of shooting or were about to shoot, and it obviously has put a lot of things into disarray.
Yeah. Though I think
Congratulations.
Congratulations. And there's obviously a bit of a faux horror element. I mean, we're not here to do an interview on The Other Lamb, because we could have trash talk it basically if you're on the show.
No, thank you. My ego is healthy, but not that healthy. Not for like live notes.
So Catherine, that scene. But it is faux horror-y. And which is an obsession with yours. So when we talked to you about coming on the show, you wanted to do faux horror, and we took a vote, and then you ended up having the deciding vote, which seemed very appropriately faux horror.
I just wanted to.
You got the final choice, like Danny from Midsummer, about which one survived. So we picked Midsummer. So do you want to kind of like talk about briefly about what this film means to you, and obviously spoilers for everyone.
So I guess Midsummer / folk horror in general, I think I picked Midsummer because it's a fairly accessible intro into folk horror. Ari has talked in a few interviews about how he definitely views it as fitting within that subgenre and very actively being a part of that. So because of that, it knows what the rules are and plays with them, but it kind of sits really neatly in there, and it knows that it's folk horror basically. So I thought it's a good entry for people that go, oh, is this folk horror? Or I haven't watched this kind of film before, or maybe they've watched it, but they didn't connect it to that kind of subgenre within horror. And it's a really awesome film. I lied to you guys. I thought I had seen the director's cut, and I hadn't. I had read the director's cut. So it was interesting watching those scenes and picking out what scenes in the script had not even been filmed, or at least weren't in the director's cut, and then what ones had been added in as I was watching and went, oh, I don't remember this scene. So yeah, it was good.
Can I ask as a noob, what makes horror folk?
I mean, I'd say there's a few key things. One of them in particular is almost always journey from city to rural. So either an isolated country town or, the country in general. I don't think you could have a folk horror film set in a city as a setting. You just couldn't. And that beautiful mural at the start of Midsummer is really interesting because it literally shows you that journey from like it tells you the plot of the film, which I love. It's such a baller move. But, you see the city in the background, and then you see her movement towards the idyllic rural. That's a pretty key part of it. I think also generally a sense of isolation, either isolation within a character or isolation in terms of a community going insular and becoming a bit strange. I'm sure there's folk horror films that don't do that, but that feels like a pretty key part of the genre for me. That's that. I mean connection to nature. Like there's often a slight sense of kind of rightly or wrongly, like that people have forgotten their connection to nature and that this is the right way, but it's the right way with kind of a cost. So, and I think a lot of us, I'm certainly trapped inside. So that feeling of reconnecting and going to an idyllic place and reconnecting with, a simpler way of living is something that I'm very attracted to, even as I'm aware that I would be garbage at it. So, yeah.
I think it's hilarious about the complexity of the pagan rituals that you describe it as simple, idyllic living, because it seems anything but simple. And I started watching the Wicker Man at your recommendation as part of this.
Yeah.
I still got like 20 minutes to go, so I haven't come to the crazy psychedelic ending yet. Looking forward to it. This seems really complicated. This seems like really complicated.
Well, it's very complicated, but it's also very simple. And it's not to bring it back to my film, but it was something that was definitely something I was trying to do in The Other Lamb, which is it's that certainty. Like we sacrifice this thing on this day of the week, and then we bury this thing in this field, and our crops will be okay. And that's something that's pretty missing from modern life. I don't know about you guys, but if I could sacrifice a lamb and guarantee a script getting off the ground, like I'm not saying would do it, but I'm not saying I wouldn't.
I would 100% do it.
I mean,
actually,
we sacrifice lambs for like cutlets all the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, and script getting made is more than a cutlet.
Yeah.
I mean, cutlets are pretty amazing, but
I will say I actually don't eat lamb anymore after the film because I felt too bad. So it was a bad example, but yes, it's so, you know, I think it's that certainty, which is the thing which kind of, it's idyllic and simple in the sense of life has rhythms and you follow those rhythms, and life has rules and you follow those rules. But also if you transgress out of those rules, you get punished. So that's kind of why I think it appeals to me as a subgenre of horror.
I think we'll definitely talk about transgression because what happens to the characters that we're following in this movie depends on their levels of transgression against these rules of the rural setting.
Yeah, it does, but it's interesting. I think there's an argument that the British couple don't transgress at all and they still suffer the same fate. So I actually think even though they all transgress in very different, very distinct ways, in that really classic horror movie way, I kind of think that as soon as they got there, they were screwed no matter what. So
yeah. And I mean, I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is the end, but perhaps we should discuss the end further into the podcast. But I'm not sure. I mean,
let's kind of just for the I'm speaking to an audience of one here and presuming that there might be others, that I know my mum's tuning in without having watched the film because she doesn't like horror. Right. So there's a few people that may need a refresher. Or like that audience of horror fans, quotation marks, that just read the Wikipedia entries and that's it. Or like me with Hereditary, I never saw the film. I only read the script. So let's just kind of give a brief summary of the film. At least it orientates us, and then remind the audience who the characters are. So let me just bring up the PowerPoint. This is the this is the Wikipedia summary. It's not like we spent a whole lot of time on the logline, but essentially. It's we can ignore the cast. Like, I mean, that's important if we start describing it as Florence rather than Danny. Basically, a group of friends travel to Sweden for a festival that apparently only occurs every 90 years, and then find themselves in the clutches of the pagan cult. That's the largest setting. There's a little bit more of a complicated setup for that I know Catherine wants to talk about, because essentially this is running in parallel to the disintegration, the crumbling of a relationship between Christian and Danny, who are a couple. And early in the film, it's almost like within the first 5 minutes, the inciting incident of the film is Danny's sister committing murder-suicide, killing her parents and herself.
What's interesting,
it's very nightmarish.
It's not really the inciting incident in that isn't what prompts her to go overseas necessarily, but it's certainly the horrific, they come back to it again and again, but it's an interesting one because I have some thoughts on the opening and kind of why they structured it that way, which is similar to It Follows and The Witch and things, where it's like you get buy-in for your audience.
Because for me, the exploration of Danny's grief, and I'll put my cards on the table. It's still a film worth breaking it down. I thought the exploration of the grief of Danny's grief was the weakest part. I thought it was basically window dressing. And I personally think the film would have been better without it because it didn't resonate to me at all as being about grief. It felt like someone who's watched movies about grief, just using it as an excuse for horror moments. That's how I personally feel. I really Maybe other people disagree with that. But it could be because it's not built into the dramatic engine that I felt it. And you may have resonated with you on a more symbolic thing, on a more symbolic level.
It's not so much grief as it is the urge to belong, and her urge to have someone. And I think her family leaving in such an abrupt way was just a way of destabilizing even further her need to have people around her and to have a place that she belonged. I feel like that was kind of the function of it for me.
Well, yes, which to me says that it's not really about that. As in, it's not really about exploring what it would mean to have your sister kill your parents. It kind of became a way of doing something to the couple. Anyway, I mean, that's just a personal criticism when we're not really here to criticize the film. I just wanted to put that on the table.
But I don't think you're wrong, Stu, in that I found, I think with you, the much more fascinating element to Danny's journey being like her relationship to Christian, as opposed to her relationship with either herself or her grief in terms of how that was dramatized and how I understood that from the film. But like you said, Catherine, it feels like the horror of the tragedy that happens at the beginning lets you get through almost 90 minutes without another big horror movie beat, I guess.
Other than the suicides at the cliff.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about like where those beats sort of happen along. There's certainly moments of horror, but there's very few moments of fear. I don't know.
Yeah, there's not that many jump scares. And I mean, I have some thoughts about the structure and how it deals with tension and release of tension that aren't directly related to folk horror, but I think this movie does in such an interesting, effective way.
Well, should we talk about the different types of, like, what to me, what set Midsommar apart? And Stu, would you mind bringing up my very hastily thrown together slide, once again stealing from Stephen Cleary on fear? So Stephen Cleary.
So sorry, we jumped ahead. I just wanted to finish off the characters just to orientate. Josh is one of their friends that go with them. They've been invited to this. Is my pen? Maybe my pen's come. Yes, I think it is. By Pell, who's a member of this community, who's a friend of these that all study effectively anthropology. This is it's set up, but it kind of drives their character motivation. Pell grew up in this commune and has said, "Hey, come to the commune. You're my friends. I really want you to be here. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity." Right. The only friend that's not on this slide, this is just what happens when you look for slides, is
Marcus.
Yes, which Mark. Him. The guy that looks like Matt Damon. You know, it's true. So he's kind of the classic American, like at some point, if we get the opportunity, it'd be great to talk about character function, because this has got that great horror ensemble thing where every character is kind of a slightly different archetype. And I think the writing is really strong because they feel more than the archetypes. They feel true. Anyway, so cool. This is the slide that you wanted, Chaz?
Yeah. So, anyone who's listened to any of our episodes know that we bang on a lot about narrative POV. So where the audience is in relation to the characters that you're with at any given point in time. And Stephen Cleary very kindly also put these in the context of horror movies. And these are just labels, but they're interesting to think about. So fear in relation to the present, he labeled terror, but think of that as the jump scare, right? You're in the moment with the character, and as the character is scared, you are scared too. Fear in relation to the past is horror, and often that's, gore or body horror, because you've come across something that is horrific that has already happened. It's not necessarily an immediate threat to you or in the future, but it is fear-inducing nonetheless. And fear in relation to the future is dread. And he said fear in relation to the uncertainty of time is unease. And I mean, that mainly plays out in ghost stories, like movies like, is it Don't Look Now? What's the one?
Yeah, but I actually think this has got a big part of that. The whole point of this being there's a whole sense of unease because you're never sure about the passage of time, because this is set in, again, for those who haven't seen it or need the reminder, because it's set in a Sweden midsummer, like basically on their solstice. There's it's almost all daylight. So you lose the passage of time. Time feels more arbitrary. And I think one of the strengths of the film's hypnotic feel is that, like the characters, I begin to lose the sense of time while watching.
And also, I mean, there's at least 2 sequences, if not 3, where they're tripping balls, and that also contributes to the uncertainty as to how time is passing and what's happening, in relation
what's real and what isn't. And
so I mean, the only reason why I brought up this simple slide is that this movie, for the most part, seems to rely very heavily, and I think what sets it apart from other horror movies is in dread. It just builds and builds and builds. And I think Stu and I both had a similar reaction, because I only watched it for the first time last night, and Stu, I think you watched it 2 nights ago. We both felt we knew the ending, but I didn't feel the film. like the film less because I could see the ending coming a mile away. It was almost telegraphing all the time what the ending was and just making you terrified for that ending coming.
Oh, even the mural, the mural is literally the film. Like it opens with it. Like it's such a crazy thing. For me, and I think it's really similar to this side, I think about tension in horror films all the time. So there's a tension that happens. There's a tension that happens when the audience is ahead of the characters. There's a tension that happens when the audience is behind. So a character is doing something and you don't know why. And the tension that happens when the audience is ahead is, oh no, don't go in there. Like that's that really classic thing because you know more, the killer's in that room. And there's a tension when you're with the characters, you only know pretty much what they know. So, you know about as much as say Danny or whatever. And this is a film that for basically and then there's it's different but related, but there's a tension that gets released when every character in the film finally knows what's going on. So the classic moment in Cabin in the Woods is like you have when one of the girls gets killed in the forest. That's the first release of tension because you've had your first death. And then the second release of tension is when all of the characters are suddenly aware that, oh my God, someone's died, this is serious. So like that release, it's related to the audience point of view. It's basically when the audience knows way more than the characters, there's this push and pull. And then when the characters are all finally up to speed, oh my God, people are dying. There's actually a release in horror films. Like it almost always hits about a third of the way in, maybe sometimes half. This film, it technically hits 5 minutes before the end. And I think that's part of, because like at no point does Danny, right up until the very final sequence, actually know that stuff has definitely happened. And it's just so, because that relief of, oh my God, at least they know that stuff is really going down now, it is just denied you until the very last moment, which is so hard to do. And I'm so impressed that it works, but I think it contributes to that overwhelming feeling of just tension as you're drawn through the film, because you just want them to know. You just want the characters to know what you know, basically.
Did you ever get frustrated watching the film in that it telegraphs so much what's going to happen? That frustration of they don't know they're in a horror movie and they're not making decisions accordingly?
I think I didn't as much because they didn't feel too stupid. Like generally that frustration comes from, why wouldn't you leave? Why wouldn't you call someone? Why wouldn't you do this? And it just felt like by the time it was really like, oh, you should be getting out of there, that the train had left the station, like there was certainly a moment, but they were so friendly and so nice. And like, I think part of it is because that first sequence that we'll discuss in a sec doesn't happen to your characters, it happens to people from the village. And so that allows you moments of gore that if that was happening to one of our characters, you'd be like, get out of there. There's no reason why you would stay, or at least not be running into the forest. Whereas the way that was structured meant that you got some of that horror and you got some of the gore, but it was still kind of believable that the characters would stay. So I didn't feel that frustration of, God, the characters aren't acting like humans too much. And it's interesting, I'm assuming you guys read the script as well, but the scenes that were cut out were definitely often to do with that like awareness of like, we should leave and what are you guys doing? And it really verbalized a lot of that. And a lot of those obviously went.
Yeah. Well, that feels like as good a point as any to discuss the first ritual. So just to summarize briefly is, as Stu said, Danny has been the victim. Well, not victim isn't the right word, but her
bystander.
Yeah, her family have all died very suddenly in horrific circumstances, and that prompts her to follow her boyfriend, with whom their relationship, Christian, was already on the rocks, with his anthropology friends to see this Midsummer Festival. And they arrive, and it does seem very idyllic that first day when they arrive, and there's a lot of sort of sense of warmth and community and joy and freedom from the city life that they have there. But then we get to the first ritual, So Stu, this was something that you were particularly interested in discussing?
I'm just bringing up the script. I was just curious to see how they had written it, because there's something interesting about the direction in this film, that it's very there's a very strong formality to it, right? And I think that sits in deliberate contrast with the kind of the familiarity of the genre. And, you know, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, right? And I mean, rituals themselves are about familiarity, and you get the cathartic release of familiarity. And a running theme that we haven't quite talked about yet in this film is there's a lot of reflection of emotion, a lot of repetition. So if you scream, someone else will scream with you. And that's something that's kind of seeded early in the film in this scene, and becomes more of a stronger element at the end, that people share in your pain by echoing it, right? And so maybe there is something in the structure of the film. So I was particularly interested because it's a very shocking moment. Essentially, and we're set up, right? I can't remember the exact pronunciation. I'm scanning through the script now, and I guess I could share it so everyone doesn't have to look at my face as I scan it, which is like a Tesuban. Oh hell, I'll just scare it. I'll just share it. Okay, here it is. What's that word? A Tesuban. Is it scary? Josh teasingly raises his eyebrows. You'll see. It's a great setup. I mean, it is telling the audience, yeah, it's going to be horrifying. We know something that we've talked about a bit recently is about the point of, and I'm getting close to articulating it, as there's a point of view relative to the text, that there's a genre awareness that good writers use. So are you ahead of the text, not just the characters, but ahead of the author? And I think, but we also kind of subconsciously know that the author is always ahead of us. So there is an awareness that we're watching a horror film. If they've done their marketing correctly, we know we're in a horror film. So when it's like, is it scary? And he's like, you'll see. We're like, oh yeah.
Probably.
And so you get, so therefore you get dread. You get the build up, right? And
I will also, something to point out about this trailer, which I really love, is that because I rewatched it, and I'm sure there were different cut versions, but it's so hard to remember this. But before I walked into this film and saw it, and you guys wouldn't have had this experience as well, because you probably have seen too many of the memes or too many of the GIFs or whatever. The impression this film gave was that the main character was Christian, very strongly. It was all cut together so that you thought the lead was him. All of the perspective was him. And that is not true. It is not his film. And I thought it was a really smart way of, you know, the trailer is an accurate representation of the film in terms of tone and what kind of film you're going to go see, while also being completely misleading, which I really like.
I must have seen a different trailer, because I showed the trailer to my wife, and she only sat through like the first 15 minutes of the film with me, because she hates horror movies. But in that 15 minutes, she saw the Mark character and was like, he's going to die first, right? He's the obnoxious, very...
Well, it's not Mark, but Christian. I'll see if I can find it and send a link to you guys. But yeah, there was 100% a trailer I saw that gave me the impression that like Christian was going on a trip with his friends and his girlfriend was coming along. Like that was, whereas a more accurate description is Danny is forced on a trip with her boyfriend and his friends. Like that's because she's the subject of the film, not him. So.
Absolutely. Was the poster that you remember the one of Florence Pugh crying with the...
Yes, that's the one. Like it's pretty, you know, I think it was clear that she was a main character and possibly a dual character, but even that could have been her. It just felt like it was his film, which I think is playing with the fact that in horror movies it often is, you know, in movies in general, it often is the guy's film. So, it just felt like a really smart way of doing it.
Yeah. So what's it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is using your audience expectations against them and placing the audience relative to the text. So here, I mean, it's me kind of exploring it on screen in Classic Draft Zero. On screen instead of on air. So it's kind of, I was interested in, because it's done in a kind of, so there's like this setup where they go and have kind of a ritualized meal together, and there's some beautiful shots, overhead shots showing the kind of the layout and the importance of the ritual.
That was all cut as well. That wasn't in the original. So I can, as we talk, I can tell you which scenes weren't in the original. The first meal where they talked about that's the eternal fire, all of that meal was gone. And it's interesting because I think the fire thing he probably would have wanted to be left in, but it's just that the meal feels really like it slows that front of the movie down when they get to the village. So.
Oh, okay. You're talking about us. I'm talking about where the old people come out.
Yeah. Well, so there's two meals that kind of happen quite close next to each other, and one of them was not in the. There's two. There's one where it's like it's near the yellow house. That's the second one, and then there's one that kind of happens in the village center, and Pele explains about the fire. That one's gone in the theatrical release.
I watched the theatrical release. I didn't watch the.
Oh, did you? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I didn't watch the director's cut.
Oh, you didn't watch the director's? Okay, cool. All right, don't worry then. Don't worry.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah, I'm slightly
like.
Yeah.
I'm slightly like, okay. So it's essentially what happens is they led into this. Like they describe it as an exterior beach, but I never got the impression it was a beach. I just saw it as like a rocky area where these two old people that we've seen that have come out in this kind of very ritualized thing. And I assuming that they were kind of the patriarch and the matriarch of the community, and perhaps were representations of the gods. It kind of thwarted my expectations because they end up climbing to the top of this cliff and launch themselves from it. I'm using the word from the script. So I'm interested in how it was written, because it is a very stylized sequence. It's this kind of contrast of this incredible, great prosthetics, right? Like the head, the impact, the body horror of what happens to these old people's bodies when they hit the ground is awful, right? But it's directed in, and so it's got like this kind of like almost gratuitous obsession with that, with this very stylized, disconnecting idea, because I guess it's about putting us in the experience of the characters, because those kinds of moments of horror are very disorientating. We've seen those car, we talk about those car crash moments where it's like a combination really slow, but you got a very different sense of what's going on. So I was interested in how that was written on the page. I'm not sure if I got any particular observations. Maybe there's anything that jumps out to you. But it feels very kind of matter of fact in terms of how it's directed. Shock silence. Danny looks like she's being knocked out of her body. I mean, that's like it's not unfilmable, but it's definitely kind of like veering into that. Disassociated. Danny turns to look at, I guess that's the word that I'm saying. I'm saying disconnected. It's about disassociation.
I think it's interesting because I'm very pro unfilmables. I've kind of listened to you guys talk about them before, and I think you can definitely, I've watched scripts where it's like she stares into the distance thinking about her dead son, and it's like, I don't know how you show that necessarily, but at the same time thinking about things she's lost, I kind of do know how you see that. And like disassociated, you kind of see it in her eyes, and the sound tells you as well. Everything drops away from her in that moment, and that's not written on the page, but obviously this is a writer director, so he knows how it's going to go down when he writes it and then when he directs it. And you just get that sense of that absolute shock, but also just that she'd completely become untethered in that moment as well, compared to say Connie and Simon, who are freaking out, and I think a lot more understandable ways, in a strange way.
And it's interesting because that's what I was interested in seeing, and now I see it, how they did that on the page, and all he's done. And having looked at Hereditary, he was quite descriptive about what the camera was doing. Descriptive, probably prescriptive. And there's still a little bit of that, from Danny's point of view, the man who arrived at Dan's feet, raises the cudgel, it's kind of prescriptive.
That wasn't how it was shot. Like it's not directly from her point of view in that shot. They go close sometimes as well. So obviously things change.
But it's interesting just the use of the italics, to kind of indicate that this is going to end up eating or echoing in the style,
Yeah.
and how it kind of draws attention to Danny's reaction. I just think they're just kind of like a few observations. I mean, that's it. It wasn't a storytelling thing. It was like, this is an incredibly well directed part, and it felt that the disassociation was a very important part of what the film was trying to do structurally.
Well, because
and
this
so
moment is buried at the end. So her moment at the end is absolutely disassociated and then euphoric. And there's a great line very early on in the script where Pele says, Danny's talking about she does psychology and that's how you can tell she's crazy. And Pele says, oh no, I can tell that from the glint in your eyes. And that's the end of the film. That's just what the end of the film is. So, and there's another great mirroring moment really early on that then at the end ties it all together beautifully. But it's just, I think that ritual scene there and then the ritual scene at the end are really two peas in a pod in terms of what they're trying to do. And I suspect when he was writing that he had that scene and the end scene not at the same time, but when he was smoothing out the script, they feel like if you change things in scene 45, you change things in your final scene. Like they feel very connected.
And like you pointed out earlier, Catherine, that scene, it doesn't happen to any of the characters. And I think that's quite important because it stops any of the foreigners leaving. Because if something had happened to one of them, I think there would have been a much
freaked out,
bigger sense of like, we've got to get the hell out of this place. This isn't safe. But because it's kind of a ritualized part of their life that they're observing, that allows them to stay. And the kind of next, it's the whole second act of the movie, pretty much. There's no more deaths. Connie and Simon,
on screen,
they disappear, and the audience and Ari Aster, no one's pretending that they haven't died. Like it's very obvious. The only kind of nod that they sort of do towards the characters not worrying about their disappearance is actually making it in relation to Danny and Christian's relationship, where the story that the community is telling the foreigners is that they left one by one separately and that he abandoned her first. Simon abandoned Connie.
It's interesting because in the script they really go into that Connie and Simon stuff a lot more, and then in the director's cut they do again as well. So the script is like 20 extra scenes. The director's cut is like 6 extra scenes, and you just didn't need them. Like you figured out what was going on, you knew what was happening, and it was kind of plausible. Like, oh, we dropped him off at the station, and then she went too, and then but he left her, but kind of not, and then Josh stealing the book. Like it's just. They were so nice, and I was like, oh, like get out of there. But at the same time, it was always so plausible, so I wasn't too mad. And and that the sacrifice scene, like, because it's implied that they do this. This is part of the ritual in terms of these are the people they are dedicating to at the end and all of that. But also that in general, you turn 72 and that's it. And like, I think part of the reason why it works that they wouldn't leave is it is that thing where you go, well, is it that much better than, one of them says, like, it's better than dying in a nursing home with no one visiting you. And I'm like, it's not completely wrong. So that's why they stay. And I think that, and again, it comes back to that folk horror thing of like a simpler way of life, but potentially a better way of life. So,
or you can understand the point of view.
Yeah. Which is what all the best
and obviously this isn't an episode about The Wicker Man, but what's interesting about The Wicker Man, which is a 1972 folk horror film about a policeman investigating the disappearance of a child. So a little bit more of a genre through line on a Scottish island that he discovers is kind of quite pagan. And it kind of like pagan in the capital P kind of idea of pagan, and doesn't feel specifically any, which is slightly irritating to me. But ignoring that, it actually starts The Wicker Man with him in the middle of it's not just Christian, like a Catholic Eucharist. So it's this is the blood of Christ, this is the blood of Christ, and so there's a direct comparison between the rituals of his Christianity, which he sees as the true religion, and okay with the horrible heathenness of paganism, and there's all these scenes in the church and the cross, and you're like, well, no, I mean, you know, what's the difference between worshiping your deity being someone that was put on a cross and worshiping, you know, something being set on fire? And like that film's drawing more comparisons. It's interesting in Midsommar they've pulled that stuff out. You know, that kind of obvious comparison.
I think because young people in this day and age are much less likely to be religious. So if one of them was like, hey, I'm super Christian, you'd almost be put off at them being slightly alien. Whereas instead they're kind of smug anthropologist Americans, but they're overtly not religious.
And that creates an interesting tension because it's about there and why they choose, and why it's a good setup, because it's like, why do they choose to stay? It's because they're kind of interested. And it's like, well, you know, while in Rome, basically, we should do this thing. And, you know, who are we to judge?
We don't, because, you know, it's not that America has less of a culture, but it's definitely less culturally fixed. You know, there's that idea that, like, I mean, I love the Josh character and how it's, he's so like, to someone that's like a high priest of the religion, he's like, oh, this is like the blah, blah, blah. Like, it's so disrespectful. It's like going into a church and being like, oh, this is like the Anglicans. Like, oh, actually 300 years ago, they did this. And it's like, you just wouldn't do that. But he's so like, I prefer Mark in some ways, because at least Mark, he just is what he is. He's a dickhead, but that's fine. Whereas like Josh is like the smart, intelligent one that is also actually just as disrespectful in his urge to like catalog it and make it like, and put it in his anthropology stuff versus actually respecting it.
And that's part of the structure of the films in terms of their deaths, is it's tied to their transgressions. And we may end up we've been talking about it for years, of doing an episode specifically on the different types of transgressions with Mike Jones, but it's worth covering here. Essentially, my understanding of transgressions is they're like the sins, right? And that they come from like the idea of like a fairy tale or a medieval morality play where you commit a sin and you are punished, right? Yeah. So in the context of this film, and as you say, what is interesting is that as much as it uses the structure of the transgressions, as it turns out, what is revealed to us is that it wasn't going to happen, but it misleads you. So the transgression of Mark, is it Mark that goes first? No, it's Josh that goes first. Josh, in his smugness,
Mark dies first.
Okay, so he does die first. So
because Mark is the one that comes up to him with the skin face.
Ulf is wearing Mark when he kills Josh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It took me 2 viewings to get that, because I was too scared the first time I saw it. I was like, oh no.
So what happens is Mark essentially has a whiz on the tree that we have seen, not massively, but there's an implication because we see them burn the bodies of the elderly couple that have jumped off the cliff. They're burnt, and then there's the ash. And we see them spread the ash, and then we hear off screen. So we don't get the dread of Mark going and doing something stupid and us going, don't do it, Mark, don't do it, Mark. We hear someone yelling at him, and then we reveal him having a piss on a tree, which is like a sacred tree with all the ash of obviously their ancestors, right? And they're furious at him, and he's like, I didn't know.
And that seems really interesting. It's very choreographed. Like on the page, he talks about the background and the foreground and where everyone is and going off stage. Like it's very intricately written. And it's a long scene. It's a long scene that it does have cuts, but like it's, you know, there are lots of long.
Cool. I'm gonna bring it up
where things happen.
It was one of them. Found it
because it's also, you know, Mark is he's the one that throughout the film is like, oh no, ticks, and I don't like nature, and like, can we walk here? And you see he's very deliberately uncomfortable in nature, and again, it's that thing of, out of all of them, he's that really overt, dumb American, but also very much the city boy that's being forced to go into a countryside setting.
So here you go. Yeah, it does. It's like in the background, Ulf has noticed something horrible, but earlier Ulf in the background is now taken to praying silently. You know, we get the actual Swedish written in.
If you scroll up a little bit further, I think it's just the start of the scene. Like it's a long, you know, there's lots of stuff.
Here you go. That's cool. Yeah. That I'm going to highlight that. That's interesting that they've chosen bold to emphasize in the deep mid-ground. Because I've started doing that a little bit in scripts, like in the foreground, in the background, in the BG.
You can when you direct it. If I wrote that on the page, the director would be like, jump off a cliff, you know.
Sometimes it's the easiest way to articulate. I'm thinking specifically of a project where the whole thing is there's fixed camera point of views. And so part of me is the right, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, so I have to say in the BG, this is what's happening because I know that we can't cut away. So I want them to understand, they can change it, but it's like, so I've thought about it. But that's interesting. So in the deep mid-ground between Mark, Josh, and Pele are two ceremonially dressed men surrounded by onlookers. They finished the ceremonial song before chopping a straw goat to 3 sections, celebrated by silent clapping.
Kind of don't. Yeah.
But it's definitely setting up that we're going to see something again coming to this feeling of dread. Oh, and they keep on going that, like in brackets here. Beyond her, one of the straw goat choppers has walked up to a hole in the earth. So we're getting a sense of the ritual.
I don't know that was emphasized that much, but it just feels like we actually just stick with that Josh scene and all of that kind of, I think it's happening in the background still in the version that's there, but it's all just that stuff with like the rune and do I have permission to write about it and what's going on and all of that.
So, I mean, just in terms of craft, what Ari is doing on the page here is he's spending the vast majority of his big print writing out in great detail what audiences on first watch may not ever notice, but is very important to him and important to the detail of the piece, which is the burying, the ritual behind the ashes of these two old people that Mark then goes and pisses on.
And this is great because, you know, here we go. So Mark is standing behind the fallen tree, urinating. His 2 juice cups are resting on top of the giant fallen tree. When he sees his urine side scene ceases, yelled at, stupefied. Mark zips back up, utterly confused. He steps out from behind the tree, but is still standing on the ashes. And they don't cut. I don't think they don't cut to it, but everyone's reaction to him stepping is like that classic American thing. And I think that's a great bit of writing because there's something we've talked about is the given circumstances of the world. And for these characters, the given circumstances is this is holy. And when they act this, when they perform this, they need to behave as if he is still fucking up. And we don't necessarily need to show the audience it because we see it from their reactions.
But I think it is, you know, like, because you have to think about how this film would have gone for these people if they had done everything right, if they'd been utterly respectful, not asked stupid questions about the book, not forced, you know, not pissed on trees, not done all of that. And I think the answer is that they still would have died. So that is the one thing where it's like it breaks that classic kind of horror movie. Here's your transgression. Here's the time you had sex. Here's the time you'll meet someone. Other than maybe possibly the argument you could make is that because Pele chose to bring them there and wasn't the one that initially asked Danny, but then was happy she came because he was obviously kind of hoping that she would join versus be sacrificed. There's an argument that their transgressions happened well before the film. This is like, this is the ultimate, you know, Josh doing what he did, Mark doing what he did, all happens, but Pele chose them. So he chose Christian, who isn't very nice to Danny. He chose Josh, who is very kind of painfully academic about like looking at other cultures and just dissecting them versus actually respecting them. He chose Mark, who's just a dickhead. So there's the argument that yes, they transgressed in this and they would have died anyway, but that's why Pele chose them. So, you know. And
yes. I think that's in there. You get Pele's disapproval of them early in the first act. When he's having that conversation with Danny, you get that feeling that he doesn't really super like them.
Yeah, and also as you said, Catherine, where Connie and Simon ostensibly did not do anything wrong and they're the first to vanish. I mean, they did react horrifically to that first ritual where the old people die, but what you've seen is the elder lady criticizing Ingmar for not preparing them for the ritual rather than being angry at Connie. And
what they did wrong was Connie didn't die, but their transgression, it's a really subtle moment. Their transgression is that Ingmar dated Connie and Connie started dating Simon, and then
I thought that was a good bit of foreshadowing. As you say, this is
just a tiny little
There was something about, I'd have to look at it, and I'm interested to see it in the script, that it felt like it was kind of underlined on screen, that you go, even though it's a throwaway line, that there was definitely enough of a back and forth about it that you go, this is important.
Yeah.
You know, that they have a little bit of an argument that makes it a little bit sticky. I don't know if you found that, Chaz, but there was something about like, oh, we didn't actually date, blah blah, and I was like, no, this is important. That this is what's happened.
I mean, it depends what we're talking about in terms of transgression, right? Mark, I wanted him to die. I was looking forward to him dying. It was like that classic horror trope. It's like, here's the asshole. Let's wait and see how he's gonna go. You know. But with Christian, he did not transgress the rules of the community, did he?
Well, the rules of the community.
He transgresses with Danny, right? Like his relation,
Danny,
right? There's a clear, the audience is on Danny's side in terms of how poorly they're treating each other, right? I mean,
no, just him. Like this might also be a gender thing. I'll be blunt.
Yeah.
I know that guy. Every woman I know knows that guy. He gaslights you. He makes you think that your emotions aren't valid. You end up apologizing to him because he's upset because he was bad to you. Like, it's just, you've either dated that person or you know that person. And really similarly to the Wicker Man, actually, and Ari's talked about this at the end, you should feel slightly weird about how happy you are when at the end, what happens to him happens when he gets put in a bear suit and lit on fire. And I've never been
spoilers.
So happy. Well, you're listening to it. I've never been so happy to see someone die. And I feel the same way about the Wicker Man, which is interesting. For a protagonist that I'm meant to be rooting for, I've never been happier to see someone get put in a giant structure and set flame. And oh my God, it physically hurt me sometimes seeing him on screen because he's not the asshole that's hitting her across the face or doing something that's very, very clearly coded that way. He's just the one that makes you doubt your own reality. And like that phone call at the start, I have been on a million of those phone calls. I've either made them or had friends make them to me where you're like, I'm not sure, am I overreacting? And they're like, no, you're not overreacting. He's meant to support you. Like, it's just, he's the worst.
And I felt the same sense of catharsis when he died. Like, I enjoyed him dying. I felt very strongly that he was an asshole. It just feels that it doesn't really matter whether his transgressions are against Danny or against the rules of the world, but it goes to the point that we were making, is that these people were likely going to die
no matter what.
Anyway, it's not necessarily about their transgressions. I guess I also felt that, yes, Mark is an asshole, but perhaps didn't deserve being stitched into a bear and burnt to death for his gaslighting. Christian, for his gaslighting assholery.
I think he did by the end, because again, I feel very strongly about this, but like, there's a moment in the script, there's a really interesting line where it's actually quite close to that scene we saw there, where it's Danny looks at him and for the first time is a bit afraid of him. Like, it's a very particular, Danny eyes him disturbed by his nonchalance.
Which page is this?
I'll see if I can find it. It's a really key moment, and then I rewatched the film with this in mind.
Okay, so on page 61, I'm gonna share the screen so that everyone else can see the line that we're talking about here. Line. So can you see that, Catherine?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's the moment when he gaslights her and dismisses her, and like, this is again why I think I'm not that bothered by why they don't try and run away. Like, she knows what her lived experience is. They've just seen some people jump off a cliff. They should really be fucking going. And Christian is just like, no. You're the one that doesn't get it. You should stay. Like, in the thing, it's like he's very clearly focused on his weird PhD and all of that stuff. And that's when I think, especially, you know, he doesn't listen to her. He doesn't respect her. He totally deserves to be stitched into the bear.
Okay.
The person that doesn't deserve it is the bear, I feel.
Yeah, definitely. The bear was unduly butchered. But so there's some things that I'm not sure were missing for me, but maybe it goes towards what Stu was saying before, where the grief subplot seems to be distracting from what could have been a stronger film if it was just about a woman being
Gaslit.
feeling gaslit, but also gaslit into isolation, right? Because
Yeah.
the way the film starts, right, is she's really worried about her sister and her parents. She has that call with him. And she then is talking to a different girlfriend who's just girlfriend in the script.
Yeah.
And she's like, as you said, she's saying, was I too much? Or like, is this in my head? Am I leaning too heavily on him? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you've got the scene with him and the guys in the pizza shop where they're like, you should dump that crazy girl who doesn't have sex with you enough as quickly as possible, right?
Yeah.
The relationship's been broken for a year. So that is a very interesting thread for me. But the whole movie seems to be centered on how isolated she is. And I never felt her isolation. And I think it's because of that phone call she has with that friend. It kind of, to me, indicated that she has a social circle outside of Christian. And it also seems to be like she's fighting to be included in Christian's social circle rather than Christian cutting her off from her social circle.
I think where I felt the parents were needed is that, like, the thing that huge life events like that, like a parent getting sick or a parent dying or what have you, or just, you know, losing the last members of your family, what they make you do is they make you reassess things. They make you go like, what's important in life? Who will be there for me? Who will support me? And by taking away her parents and her sister, like a version of this film that doesn't have them dying, unless she's an orphan or something like that, a version of this film where she's got parents and a sister that's non-bipolar and is supportive, isn't a version of this film where at the end, I believe that she has kind of been almost broken by this cult, but also is so desperate for acceptance and love and to be held and to feel belonged. And that's kind of, I feel like you needed to take her to that kind of broken, distressed, like the line in the script is like, she's sobbing and it's almost disturbing in its intensity. And then again, that moment is mirrored right towards the end when she's sobbing, when she's seen that really disturbing scene where Christian's with the 16-year-old. She's sobbing, but there are people with her and people mirroring her and like feeling her feelings with her. And so I think you needed that scene. You needed those scenes to both be there, to see what it looks like when someone's holding her, that she's in this place of great distress and isn't supported. And then at the, like, so I think it still serves a function. It's effectively, it's like why Disney characters can't have two parents. You can't have a stable protagonist that has everything they want in life as your starting point. So I completely understand where you guys are coming from. The grief isn't the point of it. It's the relationship. But I think for the relationship to get to the toxic, weird, dependent, I don't know what I'll do without him, but fuck, what is this guy? You need her to be completely isolated. So
and I think that's what I was missing, because she had that phone call with her friend. I didn't get a sense that this was all she had.
A friend is a friend, but like your family and your parents and your partner is meant to be the one you lean on. Like, you know.
And it's a friend on a phone, and a friend that's turned up. So
sure.
Which is still a friend, but like I completely get why if I was her, suddenly I would be, you know, I would be holding on harder to that relationship because I'm even more desperate to feel belonging.
So
look, after a couple of months of isolation, you know, I'd be signing up for a cult that lives in a nice outdoor.
I watched
completely isolated.
They kept hugging each other, and I was like, oh.
So
nice.
I think I think Stu and I had, I mean, this could be a gendered reaction to the film, which is perfectly appropriate, right?
It's not. I like how Chaz is speaking on behalf of me, but I guess he's got that right as a man to speak on behalf of other people.
Also a right that you take on my behalf all the time, Stu. But I've just shared the screen for the end of the film, right? Danny is now being taken over by an invading sense of pride and contentment. This soon evolves into a manic exhilaration. Danny beams. She's been embraced by a new family. She is queen. She is not alone. A smile finally breaks into Danny's face. For some reason, this smile might recall the photo of Danny in her parents' bedroom at the beginning of the film. She has surrendered. She has surrendered to a joy known only by the insane. She has lost herself completely, and she is finally free. It is horrible, and it is beautiful.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is fantastic, beautiful writing. Like Ari in this script, he writes very matter-of-factly in the present, but this is kind of the one bit of the movie where even in a film that's very formalized, there's lots of music doing heavy lifting, a lot of formal camera work, lots of
symmetry.
Yeah,
lots. He loves ripping off Kubrick.
So, but the script does not try to mimic that sense of tone in the action lines in the same way that, say, Moonlight does, right? Until this bit at the end where it's very similar to the writing that we saw in Handmaid's Tale, where it's telling us what is going on inside Danny's head. I personally, sorry, go.
I think that it does come across on the screen in a certain extent, which is like, it was very clear to me that that was not a happy ending. And I know there were people that read it that way, like, oh, a moment of triumph. And I read it and I watched it and was like, this is not a moment of triumph. This is, okay, she's gotten a family and she's gotten some of the things she wanted, but this is not a comfortable ending. And it was, which I think is some of the best horror endings. It's not happy. It actually reminded me a bit of the ending of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it's like you're on her face and you're like, oh, she'll never recover from this. She's free, but also a part of her will always be in that house with Leatherface. And it's, you know, it's, she's not escaping in this. It's not her running through the forest, but like she's free, but like also will never be free and will probably never come back to Earth completely ever again.
So the moment stepping a little bit back, but I want to talk about changing the ending, and it's growing on me as it's kind of important significance.
It's better on second watch, I say, as someone that has watched it, I think 2 or 3 times now.
So it's when the brother, Pele's brother, chooses to be sacrificed, which means he's choosing to be burnt alive, and they've been putting this. Is it his brother?
They're all brothers
and sisters.
So not biologically.
Well, because they're all raised together and they're all like, it's like you don't get raised by a certain parent because your parent goes off on pilgrimage, so you're all raised by the community. It was a weird thing with him where it was like, it's basically he brought new blood, and because he brought new blood, it was like that was part of it. I brought new blood in, and so I'm one of the sacrifices. So it had kind of been ordained from the start, which I thought was weird, but it's interesting.
So they're basically being put on in this set fire to this house, right? This sacred house, and they are given this little bit of liquid, and they specifically are like, this will for the pain, and. I'm going to bring up, I don't know which version. Okay, might be this version of the script.
It's got a few things where like, you know, the older people that have died have all of their like treasured belongings around them. And didn't end up in the script, in the film.
So the Inagama still smiling, watch this with, you know, so it's the fire starts burning around them and they think they're going to be okay. And then what happens is, and it's made more of a beat than it is in this script, is that when he's actually catches a light, he starts screaming, right? And you're like, oh, fuck, the pain isn't being subsided, he's not being given a painkiller, a pain relief. And then what happens?
Or at least not a sufficient one.
Like you could take Panadol and it's not going to fix it when you're being burnt alive. But he smiles right before, like they smile at each other, which I love.
Because they think it's going to be okay and it's just going to be a peaceful death, and it's not. And then what happens?
No, I don't think they think that.
Can I finish my reading of it? You don't have to agree with me on my interpretation. I've got 5% battery and I want to get it out before I have to work out what the fuck I'm going to do after this. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So essentially what happens, this is how it changed, and it's growing on me. And I think on the rewatch, I think it's important because it does tie back to what you say about friends, is that his screams are heard. And then what happens, every member of the community who is not singing begins to scream as well. They feel Ulf's pain. That's interesting in the script. For me, they don't feel it. They echo it. They perform it. But they don't go and help him.
you lost him? I've lost him.
Yeah, I've lost Stu as well.
Just as he got to the bit.
Hopefully it's recording on his machine.
Undermines that because they're not sharing in his pain at all. He is dying a horrible death, and no one is going in and running and doing anything about it. They're allowing it to happen. And in fact, their performance, the performative aspect of them being in the grief is actually, it's not that it's meaningless, but it doesn't stop his pain. And so as much as she has found a community that is going to help her, they're not actually interested in stopping her pain. They perform the idea of helping. That's my personal reading of it. And I think if I rewatched it and found more elements of that in there, I'd probably like the film more, because in some ways it's about the limitations of how you can share grief and what our expectations are of other people being able to help us go through very intensely personal traumatic experiences. No one's going to ever know what it's like to lose your parents and your sister to her killing them with carbon monoxide, right? As much as she wants someone to listen to her.
Because they all, so it's implied that this has happened to Pele's parents because they died in a fire. And he's like, I know what you're going through. I mean, I also don't, but I know what you're going through. And the key line for me was earlier on where Christian is interviewing some members of the community. And he says, how long do you grieve for? And they say, well, we grieve and we celebrate. And it's like, it's not for them, this isn't a death in the same way as it is for us. It's like they chose this is a celebration of life, just like the death on the cliff is not a death, it's just part of the cycle. Like for them, you know, they've jumped off the cliff, but there's a baby in the belly over there that will be named the same person's name. So why are you grieving? That person will come back around again. And I think it's like, you know, there's the show Dark Tourist takes a look at, there's one episode where he goes to a village where bodies are mummified and then left kind of, I think it's high up in the mountains, and they're not considered dead for the first year, and then they are, but you go visit them and you go say hi to grandma, and it's just a completely different understanding of death and when death finishes. And I think that for me, like I don't view the screaming, I view it as like, you know, the flames overtake him and he screams and then the village screams with him and feels it with him, but I don't view it as a failure. I view it as just like, he knows he's going to die in a fire. Like that's not a shock to him, and that it will probably hurt, but that's part of that rhythm of life. Because I think Ulf went in there because he failed. He failed with the tree and he felt that shame. He felt things strongly. And then Ingmar, it was because of some, you know, the thing of he like brought people to the village, and then because he brought them, it's like, well, you're part of the sacrifice. Because I think it's kind of implied that if Pele hadn't had good intuition and bought the May Queen, I think he might have been in there.
Yeah.
So whereas instead he brought someone new, and you know, again, there's a tiny line at the start, why are all the Swedish women such babes? Because we got the best women from other countries and brought them over. And that's what he did. He got Danny. So yeah, it's kind of, it's a tiny line. There's an interesting reading of I'm a little bit uncomfortable at Ruben. That's probably the bit of the script that I think, and the film that I think might age not great. As in 5 years, we might be a bit like, oh, that's not ideal.
So just to be clear for our viewers / listeners who haven't seen the film, Ruben is the deliberately inbred oracle child who has facial deformities, which seems to be an Ari Aster thing following Hereditary.
He doesn't dislike it as a thing.
And it just, unlike Hereditary, it felt not part of the plot here at all.
So it's apparently, there are some really subtle moments, and I reread the script and then watched the film, and it really helped me with that. I'm worried about Stu's battery. I don't know if you have like, maybe you can go to your phone. Is that in the cards? No?
It would have to be.
There's a moment when
I'm going to the iPad. It's about to drop out. So.
Oh, okay. There's a moment when they do this beautiful shot when they're driving, and you know the camera flips, and it's, I mean, some of the shots in this I'm just like, oh, I'm never going to make films ever again because this is too great. And but there's a banner along the road which in the script is deliberately, you know, it's in Swedish, and 99% of the audience will never know what that means, but it's an anti-immigration banner because Sweden's very much become a far right place, and it has they have, at the moment, I think they have a far right-wing political party, or at least when the film was made, they did. And apparently Ruben is a stand-in for that. So Ruben is, oh yeah, okay. Good work. You brought that up quick.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, this is the kind of stuff that gets us blocked, so I'm not going to
Do too
much of it.
Yeah, that's fair. But so
Ruben, how's Ruben? Yeah.
Also, Ruben is what happens when you are too insular, and because they say he's the product of inbreeding, and which seems very unlikely to me as well. Like, it's very specific.
Deliberate inbreeding as well.
Deliberate inbreeding, and so Ari has said in interviews, excuse me, that that's him saying that's what happens when a country becomes too insular, which I think is interesting. But then the other argument is non-insular, and that's kidnapping Danny and bringing her into their cult. So I'm not sure the metaphor completely extends, but it's,
I did not get that as the metaphor at all, that somehow Ruben was like a criticism of far-right politics.
I think it's allowed to be. Stu, you might want to mute briefly. Sorry. I think it's okay that it's subtle. Like, I don't think it needs to be a thing where like one of the characters says, oh my God, Ruben is a stand-in for what happens if we get too insular. But I think the reason why it doesn't work for me is they're like, no, we don't inbreed. We deliberately get people from outside. We're all fine. Except when we do, and it's kind of as a profit, like it would have been more consistent for me if it was like, well, generally we like being insular. We only like to stay in our village genetically. And then stuff like this sometimes happens. Then that would have actually run as a thematic line.
And it would have made a difference, like just in terms of who they cast in Florence Pugh's role, that they didn't cast a woman of color. They did cast a blonde white woman from Minnesota, really, ostensibly, but
yeah, it is really interesting because the script doesn't specify that Connie and Simon are people of color. It doesn't specify Josh. I feel like that was all found in the casting, but I will say that like Sweden's pretty well known to be not the best in terms of race and racism. And it would be a very different film if Florence had not been white. You know,
and it's making a lot, like in terms of the community you arrive at, they're a very white community. So they're obviously making some kind of, if they're bringing in blood for genetic material, you know, they're making decisions. They wanted Christian to impregnate Maya, not
and he had been shown Pele had shown his picture to Maya and had been all ordained. So again, like there's that sense that they had all transgressed before, you know, his astrological match was perfect and all of that stuff. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting, I think it's somewhat landed, but I am, you know, it's hard when you feel like you're using a person with like facial differences or whatever as basically a morality lesson into and of itself. It was the bit that I thought was maybe didn't work in the film, even though I appreciated what he was trying to say.
It just felt like a fetish to me, given that it was in his previous film and did not seem to serve that much of a purpose.
In Hereditary, I kind of appreciated that it was a character with difference.
Absolutely.
It wasn't like technically no one in that script ever mentions she has this, you know, she can't do this, and she's kind of treated the same, which like she's in a class that's clearly for kids that are not in mainstream learning, but you know, I actually thought it was done maybe better in Hereditary than it was here.
It was super important to Charlie's character in Hereditary, whereas it didn't. Like, I guess because Ruben isn't, he's kind of set dressing in this script.
Absolutely. He is like you could cut him, and the only thing is this
you could cut him from the script and nothing would change.
The only thing is this idea that he is somehow an oracle and writing these scribbles that are interpreted by the elders, and the answer is that he's just the elders can then interpret what he does, however suits their power, and they can claim access to the divine, right? And I thought it was like a degree of commentary on that, but not necessarily a strong one to the point where I don't think it was necessary. It was like almost there was too much going on, that there's a lot of aspects felt a little bit superficial, and that was one of them.
I think as always, if you cut him from the script, what would change? And not much. So.
Can I mean, in terms of speaking about what didn't work, I want to pull us back to the ending somewhat. I mean, Stu, I actually agree with your view of the Ingmar Ulf, because that whole sequence is shot from Ingmar's point of view, and Ingmar is nervous and Ulf is not nervous. And then Ingmar watches Ulf go from being beatific to screaming in pain before Ingmar burns up. So Ingmar knows that this is going to hurt horrifically. But by the by, in terms of the ending, where it's Danny has chosen Christian, and one of the differences from the script version that we have to the film that I really like is in the script, Christian can like scream and muffled scream and go blue in the face, whereas he's completely slack-jawed and this is happening to him. And it's funny. Like it's you look at his facial features as he's burning up in the bear suit, and it is funny, right? It's a great directorial choice. But in terms of what I got from the ending, I didn't get, oh, Danny has finally found a family and is no longer alone, because I guess I never had that sense of how isolated she was spelled out to me. And that could be because I'm not a woman who has been in a toxic relationship with a dude. But what I got was her release from this toxic relationship, right? And yet,
which I think it's both. Like, because it's partly just, she's finally set the toxic shithead guy on fire.
And
great.
And I was totally on board with that. But again, the imagery, and it's throughout the film, it continues to remind us of her sister and her parents' death in terms of the smoke, right? Even this burning scene that Stu's got up in front of us, the smoke is reflective back. You know, there's definite flashes back to her visualization of the death of her parents, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, I was reading it almost as if this is like her liberation from both her toxic boyfriend, but also from her grief in some way, that she's over that. And I think that's what Ari appears to intend, but I never got her sense of isolation, right? And I think what is missing for me, and it's not from the end of the film at all, but there you can see the smoke that again is like brought back a lot in terms of the carbon monoxide poisoning. Stu, you're playing with fire. Stop it, figuratively and literally. But I think what I was missing, having spoken to you guys, and what prompted it was Stu actually talking about the Wicker Man in comparison with Christian rituals as against pagan rituals, is I think I missed the funeral of her family. Because if we'd seen that funeral, we could have seen how isolated she was. We could have seen that Christian was the only person in her life that she relied upon, and he was treating her poorly, like he was deliberately isolating her. We would have seen how dysfunctional contemporary city Western grieving and those rituals are in contrast to those things. And I'm not trying to workshop the movie here. I'm just saying that the ending that we read out at the back of the script, all those things that Ari is telling me is happening, I got very little of those.
That's probably why it feels untrue, because it's deliberately ignoring an important part of Western rituals, Judeo-Christian rituals, in the way that we deal with grief, in order to make a comment about something else. But it's deliberately, it's not necessarily consciously, but they've cut out something that is a huge part of it.
But I think it's also like, I got that moment from when Christian is walking towards her apartment, and in the script it says he's running but not as fast as he could be, and then in the film it's like he's kind of fast walking, and you see him pause right before he goes in, and then that's the only person she has, and he is shit. Like, I think, because I know what you mean, like I can see that scene in my mind's eye where it's like just him and her and the funeral, and he's absolutely not prepared for what it is to be a partner to someone,
or he's cutting her off from what other relationship she could have.
All of that. But I suspect they would have filmed that scene and then cut it. Like, it's just I kind of just heard you know, him being like, oh, I was going to go to a party, but if you want me to stay in, and then her going with him. And like, that's a person that is in something that isn't good for her, but has no one else left.
Yeah.
Like, it's
And
just brutal.
I'm probably going to incur the hatred of every single one of our listeners here, but I was like, what was the right thing for him to do? He did not want to be in the relationship with her, but she's just gone through incalculable grief. Do you break up with her at that point, or do you just kind of muddy along thinking you're doing the right thing, but clearly not doing the right thing?
I think the thing is the right thing to do would have been to break up with her before then, but then after that thing had happened, I mean, that's really tough. Like, you know, I know more than a few people where something traumatic has happened when they're either close to breaking up or we're in the middle of it, and it's hard. Like, what do you do? But I think the main thing is that, you know, in fact, one of the scenes that was cut was him going like, every time you do something nice to me, I feel like I'm just waiting for the other foot to fall, and all of this stuff. And it's like, he just is a selfish man baby and can't think about someone other than himself. Because if he was someone that wanted to break up with her, but still, you know, you would just support them and go, okay, maybe I was going to break up with this person. Maybe I still see that happening in the future, but for now, this isn't about me. And he's not able to do that whatsoever. I kind of wanted to talk. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Go. I just feel that in the beginning, I got too much to latch onto with Christian, and maybe that's because I'm a guy, and maybe.
No, he's also meant to be not a bad guy completely at the beginning, because if he was like, shut the fuck up right at the start, you'd be like, oh, what a dickhead. But he's not meant to be that. He's meant to be very recognizable as like, oh, I kind of get it, you know, like, that's much worse.
And it got me there in the end. I think it got me there at the expense of feeling her isolation. Yeah. And again, like, it kind of starts as more of a two-hander. Like, you have scenes that are from his point of view, like, you know, it's not completely just on her all the time. I something to point out as well, and then I kind of want to talk about the maypole scene just in like a specific folk horror context, not just about Midsummer, but the oh god, where was it going? Maypole. No, I've lost my train of thought. Maypole I'm
scene.
sorry.
No, that's all right. I don't think it was important. But yeah, just because I think it's a really interesting one for specifically what you need in folk horror and what it's talking about. And
I'm going to be controversial, and this is I don't want to turn this into a review podcast, but I think there is an implication in there that as much as he's a piece of shit for staying with her, they talk about her gaslighting her. It's definitely denying an emotional reality, but she expects him to do a lot of emotional labor for her, right? And so there's that element of that. And I'm saying it like,
I'm glad you said it on this year.
And I'm not saying that it's just interesting that I think the film is meant to be a little bit more portrayal of the complexities of a relationship that is toxic. I'm not trying to deny that it's not toxic and that he isn't a toxic person. And I'm not saying
he is.
I'm not.
He's 100% a toxic person. Like, again, I don't want many people to be sewn into a bear and lit on fire, but like, because it beds it down for me in scene 4. So specifically scene 4, that scene tells you everything.
Yeah.
Because it's actually one of, you know, it's not folk horror related, but it's the scene that was key for me in terms of, this isn't he's kind of got a point of view. This is you're awful. So, and like, it's the kind of the intro scene. So this is someone who her sister has sent her a very worrying text saying, I can't do this anymore. And then you can see her not wanting to freak him out. So it's like, you know, a carefree tone. Hey, what are you up to? Like, cool young man hanging out with his friend. And then immediately him denying her reality. Oh, did we talk about doing something tonight? Like, just, of course we did. 100%. You definitely talk about doing like that's I know that conversation. And then it's just, not definitely, because it's her deferring to, like, if she says, yeah, we definitely did, and you're being the dickhead, then that causes a fight. And then it's like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I can swing by. Like, they've been going out for 4 years.
Like,
And he's forgotten their anniversary.
Which they've played as a reveal. I think that's actually very clever, because when I watched this, I'm pretty sure we don't learn they've been going out for so long until after this scene. To the point where I thought early on that, like, I can swing by. It could be a Tinder date, right? Or someone that she's kind of very early and that she's putting more weight on than he's prepared to give. Or
him
but
like
4 years, you're like,
it's 3.5 years, and it's like, no, she's like, no, it was 2 weeks ago, and from that you get, oh, they didn't do anything for their anniversary, because then he would have remembered. And then like Danny having and then I'm sure it's fine. She does this every other time only because you let her. Like, all of that sounds kind of reasonable. Like, you're enabling her. You can't enable, you go straight into crisis mode. Like, it's not, your concerns are completely invalid, but it's also just absolutely dismissing her, as it turns out, very reasonable concerns.
Yeah. And beyond reasonable, like absolutely reasonable. It's just crisis mode, thinking something bad. It's like, well, of course she knows her sister better than he does. He basically doesn't want to get caught up with her. He's trying to downplay it because he doesn't want to leave his mates.
Yeah. I don't want to. Okay, so just to declare my biases, my wife is currently shouldering a massive emotional load from a lot of different family members at the moment for a whole lot of different reasons. And a lot of my role in her life is actually to say things like this to her, to protect her emotionally from other toxic influences in her life. And that is, what I possibly brought to this scene, that like, he's finally gotten away from this relationship that is hurting. He's with his friends. He's in a good place. And, it's the toxic sides of his girlfriend's relationship are pulling him back in. And that's kind of what I was reading into it.
And I think like it's again, it's not meant to be a scene that's 100% clear cut, but I think the clues are there that lead to the end when Danny says to him, like the key moment in their relationship and in the script it says she finally stands up to him, is, you would have left me like Simon left Connie. Like that's because she every time she wants to say something, she swallows it down. Like, and like, and all the stuff he's saying, like, it probably is reasonable. They've sorry, I was still in the scene.
Oh, sorry, do you want me to go back?
I was going to quote a line.
Okay.
Yeah, like, because what he's saying is, as you say, it's probably not unreasonable. She's got a toxic family. She's got a sister that's always got different drama, but the subtleties are where it shines, which are like, he's with his mates and they're harassing him in the background and he doesn't want to come hang with her, and that he promised he would, or like said they would do something, and now is saying, did we say we would do something? Like, I bet, talking about you supporting your wife, if you had said, we're doing this on Thursday and we'll hang out, and then she called you distressed because her family is being shit, and you were like, did we say we were doing something? That's probably not how that would go down. Like, I assume.
You have no social life. It's fine.
Yeah. Don't make me throw you into a bear suit is what I'm getting into. But like, I think
take a number, Catherine. Take a number.
Yeah, but like, I think that's where the scene shines, in that it's not him being like, don't be stupid, everything's great. Like, it's not. It's partly he's using the language of like, she always draws you into this. Like, he's using the right words, but the tiny details where you're like, oh, this is not a supportive partner. This is not.
The more you respond, the more she's encouraged to keep this crap up. That definitely triggered me, because it's like, that's not how bipolar works, dickhead.
Yeah.
Right. So he's gaslighting her about, he's actually belittling her perception of her sister's illness. Reality.
Yeah.
Because he wants he wants the cool girlfriend, to quote Gone Girl, right?
The cool girl, yeah. Well, I think also it's interesting, again, they changed in the script to make it less, in the film to make it less clear cut. When she says, I love you in the script, he doesn't say it back. When she says, I love you in the film, he says it back. So you're not being like, because I know a character's a dickhead, or at least like Han Solo style is funny, but like, if someone says, I love you, and then the other person doesn't say it back, I know instantly that there is a power dynamic that is wrong, or something has gone wrong in that relationship. Whereas in this, he does say it back. You're kind of not meant to quite know how you feel, but like, I watched this scene and I viewed the relationship scenes as far more triggering than any heads being exploded, like by far. Like, And to be clear, I haven't been gaslit in relationships. I just like, I know this conversation, and I've had it with colleagues or with friends talking about boyfriends, where you constantly reevaluate with, are my feelings valid? Am I allowed to feel them? And are they real, or am I overreacting? Like,
I agree. I think the relationship stuff was way stronger than the perception, the grief. The grief was a tool in order to further isolate her. And I thought this stuff read really true. I'm just saying part of that reality is there is something in the relationship itself is toxic. He's a particularly toxic person, but it is a relationship that has developed in towards toxicity, right?
Yeah. And look, he might be okay in the next relationship. I would argue not, but he might be. Sometimes people get into a toxic thing and they just do need something new. And for whatever reason, both of them feel like they can't. But yeah, he is the worst.
So here's the interesting thing, coming back to folk horror, because we just like, this is really great. That is great drama, right?
Yeah, but it's not folk horror, no.
You know, but what is interesting is that I guess to compare it to Wicker Man, is that they've decided to update it and make it about, in the same way that Invisible Man, which is another film that was potentially on our list to talk about, is about toxic relationships. It is something that people are becoming conscious of, and that they're now, or conscious of in a different way. I mean, Gaslit specifically comes from a plot device in a play that's like 50 years ago, right? So it's not like it's a new idea that relationships can be toxic. But do you think that's how they've kind of reinvented folk horror? Because what is interesting with The Wicker Man is my observation was like, oh man, there's so many great hats. And I deliberately dressed in like folk horror outfit with a cap and like the woolen thing. And it's like where it's a lot more stylized in Midsummer, that you are definitely going to a more alienated place. And that kind of British crazy, like United Kingdom, oh, the village is insane, as taking a piss of in Big Fuzz. What the hell did that film? Hot Fuzz.
The
Hot
classic
Fuzz.
British setup. Yeah.
You know, in Midsummer, it's a little bit interesting. I'm just kind of curious about that thread of where folk horror, that you kind of more broadly where folk horror sits before we try to cleave some more broad screenwriting lessons.
So like, the village gaslights them, right? And I made a note as I was watching, which was basically like, they're so friendly, this is awful, because the village is like, no, your friend, she just took the truck, don't worry about that. Like it does to them in a different way, but it does to them the exact thing that is happening within that relationship, which it says your lived experience and your reality is not what is happening. And you're like, okay, I guess it's all fine. The other interesting thing I thought in comparison to Wicker Man, and specifically about folk horror, is that it's really subtle in the script and in the film, but technically it's pagan and Christian in this film, and even Christian's name being Christian I find interesting. But so they talk about St. John the Baptist Day. Apparently every 90 years is significant. I was reading up last night because St. John the Baptist was, I think, born or conceived when Mary Magdalene waited with his mother for 90 days. Like there's a lot of stuff that is Christian but twisted, extremely twisted. And you know, if you go far back enough, a lot of things that started as pagan then become Christian, or vice versa. But it's not.
Well, there's a lot of correlate, like Easter happens to you know, we took it from the pagan ritual. That's not strictly true. It's obviously like Passover. There's a lot of. It's a particularly important part of the season. That's why it's.
There's very few things that are complete, like non-porous in terms of especially religion and culture. But I did really, it seemed so alien, but then thinking about like, okay, well, if you go back enough, there are some Christianity things that actually start to look pretty alien too. And a friend that was talking to me about Midsummer was like, how do they maintain this level of bodies? And then we kind of talked it through, and it was like, oh no, it's because it happens every 90 years. So this isn't happening every year. This isn't happening every midsummer. This particular ritual is every 90 years. So that helped me in terms of the realism of how they would kill this many people. You know, even every 9 years, you'd be struggling. But it's a very deep,
have you done the maths, have you, Catherine? If I kill the number of people I can kill as a horror writer, I can kill about 5 people every 10 years and I'll get away with it.
Yeah, I'd be fine. Yeah. No, but you know, it's important for like the believability of the isolated village world and everything, I think. But yeah, it's so I kind of wanted to talk about the maypole scene if you guys wanted to bring that up.
I can.
It's kind of
Is it-
spread over a few, but it's the scene 91 is the start of it.
Yeah.
And you should have Catherine's highlighted script, Chaz.
Maybe. I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's highlighted. It's just scene 91.
I mean, I don't, but I could open up
It's in the
Catherine's.
Dropbox. It's in
I
the
know.
No, it's
Dropbox.
fine. It's fine.
Oh, Chaz.
I was highlighting my own script, buddy.
You're hanging for a bear suit tonight. That's what you're hanging for. Gunning.
Honestly, I've threatened a lot of people I know with the bear suit. I'm just like,
I'm going to
This
get
is
you a
very
bear
basic.
onesie made from a real bear. Just a onesie, right?
I mean, Stu, did you end up finding like that shot of his face when he's in the bear suit where it is like a comical shot?
That's
was
what I
on my
started
Insta.
Because he's not screaming mutely.
It's just befuddled. And also, I love how silent he is because he's been talking and being invalidating the entire film, and then he doesn't even get to scream or say goodbye.
Okay, hold on, I found it. Look how hilarious that is.
I feel
He
so
looks
bad
like
for
Chris Pratt. Like it's a comedic shot. Like,
Well,
how did I end up
very
here?
Chris Pratt.
as well. Because like
Very Chris
I-
Pratt, and I thought that was deliberate, to be honest.
I hated his face so much because of how much I hated the character. So like I hated his chin and the way he stood and all of this stuff. I'm like, I'm sure the actor is lovely and he obviously did a really great job, but like I hated him so much that I was like, this guy is just weak and disgusting and awful. Like, obviously working through some feelings, but
His wardrobe choice was very interesting. The slightly tight top to make him look slightly out of shape, you know.
yeah.
You know, like he doesn't quite take care of his appearance because he's in the
His
sloppy
scruffy
phase of the
beard, like,
relationship.
yeah.
Nothing wrong
Yeah.
with the scruffy beard.
What are you saying, Stu?
But you know, for actor / like beautiful people in films, yeah, the casting was perfect. But yeah, so the maypole scene. So
Maypole,
obviously-
not maple.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
I was like, is there a maple? Is this in the director's cut?
I mean,
They
it
kinda
is
Drink the maple, yeah.
It is a very long sequence that goes into cutting with.
Well, so there's kind of, I mean, I guess it's like, it's this one and this is the start of it. The translation is basically, we dance away the dark god. I translated all the lines and then they start. And then, so if you just scroll down to the next one, ignoring the Christian stuff, blah, blah, blah.
Who cares about Christian?
Blah, blah,
Fucking
blah,
Christian.
blah, 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 fine.
Wrap that guy in a
and
bear.
then-
Sitting alive.
Yeah, so I guess what I found interesting from a folk horror perspective with this is so it kind of articulates in a really dynamic way, like there's a community, there's a ritual, and then she literally starts, like when she looks down at her feet, she's hallucinating, she's tripping balls. So it looks like her feet are becoming like part of the grass. And then later in the scene, she's talking. The movie does it really well because they kind of have subtitles, and in the script, it's hard to tell what's going on. But like someone's talking Swedish and she's talking English, but then they can kind of understand each other and they're both talking gibberish, but in that very like, seems like they can understand each other. And so she's like, it's the start of the belonging. And like, I mean, that's the whole start of the whole May Queen sequence.
Here it is.
Effectively. So this is actually the moment when she is embraced and belongs is actually the tail of this scene. And I think it's so, it manages to both be alien in its ritual and also familiar in that, you know, a lot of us are familiar with a maypole and it's a fairly well-known, like strange thing that people do that's not quite pagan, but not quite Christian, and fertility rites and all of those things. She kind of starts to blend with nature. So this is the start of like, she gets the crown put on her head. You see the flowers breathing in some shots, which isn't from her point of view. It's from the audience's point of view. And like, but she's also weighed down by nature. Like when she's in that dress at the end, she's almost like physically struggling against what's embraced her. And I think in that folk horror tradition, it's just like, yes, you came to the idyllic rural village. Yes, you got away from that city life, but like, this is also not good. Like, because I think, you know, true folk horror shouldn't really be saying that this is a better way of living. Maybe it looks that way, but that's not the end argument. And so I love this sequence because I feel like it, when she's just like physically, I mean, that dress would be so heavy as well. But physically weighed down by nature. And you know, why I chose this film for the folk horror thing is because Ari is very aware of all this stuff, and I think is playing with it quite deliberately. Like, there's a reason why in a film about nature and about folk horror, he's weighed down his lead with like this amazing flower dress. It's a very deliberate choice. So yeah, I think the Maypole sequence for me, like, as well as just being a really cool, fun drug trip that also makes her the May Queen, it really had a few aspects that worked really well all in tandem. Like, it put forward plot, it put forward character. You had Christian being isolated and suddenly feeling like he was on the out. You had Danny,
and you get that visually, because they're everyone, including her. So part of what works in this film is that everyone is these beautiful clothes, white linen clothes with embroidery, and then the Americans stand out, and one by one they're picked off. She gets put in, she gets dressed up as to do the main thing, and he's the only one that is not dressed as part of the community. So there's a great wide shot
until he has sex, when he does get dressed as part of the community, and then he's naked because they take it off him. So he wears the robe very briefly before he has sex with the redhead.
You're playing with fire now, Chaz.
I'm not playing the scene. It's just a still to indicate.
It's not this shot. I was actually thinking specifically the scene just before, but when they do the wide shot of everyone clapping and he's not clapping and he's sitting and they're standing, but this also does the same job. And they've done a beautiful job with the eye line. I mean, this is actually an amazing bit of, I mean, it's by the by, but directing, right? Like the fact that he's in the blue in the contrast to the white, he's bent his head, the way he's positioned. So the eye scan of this, the way that the kind of lines work, means that you find him very quickly.
Yeah. And also just like, I mean, in the script they describe it, and I think you do feel it as well in the scenes, but like for once he is on the outs. So as opposed to all of the scenes where it's him and his friends and Danny's the intruder, it's the other way around. He's the one that is left on the outside while Danny is embraced by her new family, this village. So it just, for me, it was a really effective, it you know, scenes always have to do several things, and it both moved forward the plot, moved forward the character, gave you some weird cult shit, and just really took you to a new place in terms of, that her becoming the May Queen is the start of the final sequence, really. Like nothing, it feels like the boulder has been pushed off the hill after that point.
And I love that she's the last one standing out of an accident. You know, it's kind of like she hasn't actually, like, she showed the stamina to get to the final three, but it's the other two just knock into each other. And it's kind of, she stumbled into this, but I think that works. Like, because ultimately we do give her a choice, a binary choice at the end about who to sacrifice. But like, she's kind of stumbled in that position. But we think it's, I always thought in some ways that was the intention, is to kind of like that she wins the May Queen. Then, you know, maybe she cupped out early, but there was some kind of, I wouldn't put past this community to make it a conspiracy. You know, I mean, it's all the 5G towers.
Like in the because I did wonder that if it was like they let her win and that was part of it, but it really did feel like, no, this is a real ceremony, and especially in the script that's kind of supported in the sense of like, you see another woman getting knocked out and she's really disappointed. So there's no sense that they're all conspiring to have Danny win. It's like, no, it's a big deal to be May Queen and they want to be. Because I did watch it and was like, it's very convenient that she turns out like she's a secret dancer. Like, what's going on? But it felt just, I mean, that's the thing they say to Pele, like, you had good or intuition, you chose the person that ended up being the May Queen. Good work. Like, I feel like if Danny wasn't the May Queen, maybe Danny would not be alive. I don't know that 100%, but that felt like part of the reason why they kept her. So, like, why would you take that drug just then? Everything's gone wrong.
Well, because what we've seen before is that the kind of communal taking of the drugs, like when they arrive, and like him drinking with his friends, it's about being part of the community. And so at this point, he's been isolated from all his friends and separated. So he's now trying to desperately seek community, and we think he's going to get it. And that's when they dress him in the outfit.
I think one of my reasons why this film didn't work quite so well for me is I did hop off the train when Mark the arsehole disappeared, not when Josh disappeared, because they kind of explained that as in he stole the book and they all buy that he stole the book and he's run off with the book. But when Mark disappeared, that was like Christian's douchebag anchor to city life. And it just seems to be like completely forgotten. Now it happens so quick. So Mark's disappearance and Josh's murder happen almost in the same scene.
Well, I think the implication in terms of like the logic of the people going, should I leave, is that it's kind of implied that maybe Josh and Mark left together, because it's like they took the truck and
But why
you brought your friends here. Like it's a really subtle scene because it's like they're all like, it's when Christian throws his friends under the bus because he's a piece of shit.
But he throws Josh under the bus, not Mark. And I'm
He
just
does,
saying that
but-
my reaction was like, why is no one talking? Where's Mark gone?
But that's in that scene, I'm pretty sure it's like, we had nothing to do with it. We're not responsible for our friends. Like, I definitely think the implication is your two friends have both disappeared. Wait, didn't Mark go off with that girl? I guess, but now Josh is missing and the truck is missing. Like, I think what the village is telling them is your two friends have disappeared.
For sure. I just did not buy that Christian bought that Mark was facilitating Josh running off with the text.
I just assumed that Christian didn't give a fuck. At this
Oh,
point,
he's
he's
so
so
selfish.
caught up in his PhD and his thesis
PhD,
and needing the approval of the elders and his competition with Josh, that it was more important for him to stay. I wasn't. And this is interesting. I mean, in terms of screenwriting lessons, which is why we did 2 episodes on character motivation. Character motivation on this level is so much about people's personal cultural understandings and reactions that I think there's enough in there to go. They've done so much effort, put so much airtime or juice into Christian wanting to be the thesis and him trying to be a little bit alpha, that he's kind of ignores what's going around him. Because that's what he's been doing to Danny, right? He's kind of ignored her needs for his needs. And his needs at this point is that I've got this amazing PhD opportunity.
And maybe that's what I didn't buy.
The line is on page 90 where it's, where's your friend Josh? Where's your friend Josh? I know, I have no idea. He and your other friend disappear on the same day. You see how it looks. So like they very much try and convince them them disappearing is not a coincidence. And I think Christian is so caught up with like, don't cut off my access to the village. I can finally do my PhD on this. Don't worry about my friends. We weren't like this. He's so caught up with trying to justify why he can stay that he doesn't actually think about that logic. And it didn't, for me, didn't land in the film. There's a moment in the script when Christian's freaking out and running naked where he sees the truck that had supposedly disappeared. And in the script, it's actually a bigger moment than it ends up being. Because I think he's just so freaked out in the film by the time it ends up happening. But it's like, oh, that's the truck that supposedly our two friends disappeared in. Oh God. And then he sees the blood eagle chicken coop situation right after that. But,
so I think, again, this is all going to sort of moments that stumbled, and I think I can see the sort of cascading problems that I had with this, is that when Christian goes to Josh and says, I'm thinking of doing my PhD on Midsummer, I was like, oh, he's an anthropologist? He gives a shit about his education? Like, in my head, it was like Josh was the academic and that Christian was like Mark, there for douchebag purposes, right?
It's interesting. So those were some of the cut scenes. So there's a longer scene when they're confronting each other in the sleeping quarters. Because I don't know about you guys, but I love looking at what's been cut from a script and why compared to the version. And even with the director's cut, what they ended up filming and then what they did end up film, like what they filmed but didn't put in and all of that. And there's a much longer scene about like, you never work. I had to show you how to use like JSTOR. Like that's such a very obscure. It's a very academic reference. Like everything's just handed to you. Don't take my, like, this is my passion. You just follow it along. Like there's a whole thing that I think is actually quite, out of all the cut scenes, it's one of the ones where I'm like, oh, it actually, because I felt the same way as you, Chaz, when I watched the theatrical, which is that he didn't read like an academic to me in the same way Josh did, but that scene explains why, which is basically he's drifted into it and it's not his passion, but he doesn't know what his passion is. Like,
and I don't know enough about the American thesis system to understand how difficult or not it is to get a PhD. Whereas Australia getting approved because you got to find a supervisor and all that stuff that I don't think Christian, from what we had seen, would have got to PhD level.
Maybe even masters.
They just say thesis.
If he was
I don't think they say PhD.
I thought they were talking about a PhD. Maybe it's.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be masters. If it's masters, I buy it. If it's masters, I buy it.
I love this academic bigotry that's going on here.
But the US has a different thing where you can go straight from an undergrad to do a PhD. So I absolutely believe that Christian could still be a drifting, I don't really know what I want to do with my life, but he started his PhD. I absolutely believe that.
It's not a weird thing. My fun fact, even though I've got a master's from the VCA, if I was to do a PhD, my honours undergrad would count more towards that than my master's from the VCA because wasn't a research master's. Anyway, that's a little sidebar. It's this weird thing. A choice I made 15 years ago might actually have more of an impact on something that's recent. Not even 15 years ago. It's like I'm old. Don't let my good
don't
looks
reveal
fool
your
you.
age,
I'm old.
But it's interesting. All the bits that they cut from this script appear to be in dialogue, voicing character motivation stuff that they felt could cut from the theatrical, and they certainly could. I feel for the vast majority of people who were just along for the formal ride and the dread and knowing what was coming and the experience of the film. And I guess myself as a literal toxic male who empathized far too much with Christian and is fearful of the bear suit.
The film. I think it makes you feel uncomfortable.
And so I think I needed a few more of those beats just to convince me why they were still hanging around.
It's interesting. There's a really tiny example, but so when they have the hanging cloths that show you, again, this is a film that shows you many times what will happen right before it happens. So like, you know, there's a moment where there's the May Queen dancing around the maypole. There's a moment where a man is making love to a woman while people watch. All of those are shown to you in like runic paintings, and then they happen. They burn a bear alive. You see that right up in the middle of the screen, and then at the end, you're like, oh, I guess that's what's happening. And the runic kind of tapestry thing where like a woman cuts off some of her pubes and then makes him drink period blood and puts the flowers underneath his pillow, or I think she puts flowers beneath hers and gives him a rune stone. And all of that stuff is literally shown to you. But what I like, it's a tiny moment in the script, but Simon and Connie see that and they comment on it in the script, and in the film those lines have been cut. So I think it's a really good lesson for screenwriting. I'm not even saying don't write those lines for screenwriters. Sometimes you need them so that, to be blunt, other people reading it see what's on the page.
Oh, I think I just missed it.
You did. It was just before that.
They foreshadowed the bear.
Well, they foreshadowed the bear in that hut as well when they showed the, I think that was just the tail end of the tapestry scene.
But, I also love the line, like, so we're just not going to talk about the bear, are we?
Yeah. So it's this, exactly. Oh, it's so good.
And this will be what gets us blocked on YouTube.
I'm willing to play I've played the tapestry at the beginning.
Oh my God. Julio has just told us that Christian is the guy, he's the older brother from Sing Street, who's like everybody's favorite older brother in that movie.
So it's good casting against type.
I don't know what it is.
Have you not seen Sing Street?
No.
It's an amazing Irish coming of
age
age movie that's a musical where a guy to impress a girl starts a band. Anyway,
I only write musicals, Chaz. I don't watch them.
You both must watch Sing Street because it's amazing.
But like, so that tells you,
I mean, other than
marriage at the end, which did not happen because he wasn't approved to be married. But so in the script, let me see if I can find it.
The discussion with Civ in the rune.
No, it's so it's just on page 43. There's a tiny moment where again he describes exactly what you see on screen, and then the lines that are cut Simon says, wait, is she dripping period blood into the drink? And Connie says, how do you think I nailed you down? and it's just it's exposition, and turns out when you have that scene like that, you don't need it. And I'm not even anti putting that kind of stuff into the script, because sometimes I think you have to write it for the dialogue to be cut. But it is interesting. It's just so many of the cuts made from the script. Well, because I read the script while I was watching the film this time, because I'd seen it before, and so many of the cuts are just things that explain that little bit more. And in the film, they just go, no, you're not getting that bit of explanation. Like, you know, even the end of where Siv is propositioning Christian that he should have sex with this, you know, young girl. They cut like the last third of that scene because you just don't need it. They just cut out of it. So yeah, there's lots of little choices like that I think are, you know, I think this script could have been under 100 pages if you were being a bit more ruthless.
I mean, he writes out so much detail. We've already looked at what he's describing going on in the background, and for anyone,
I think even keeping the number of detail, just scenes finishing earlier and stuff. But again, that's, you know, your Ari Aster, you get to film it and then find it in the cut. So
or they just rehearse it on the day and go, we don't need the back end, but they need it for the actors or for rehearsal. Like that kind of orientation, those circumstances where an actor is placed emotionally when they're coming in and when they're coming out, and where that scene that has not occurred on screen, but how that informs the scene after. That's the stuff that actors ask you when you're on set. And the fact is, as a writer, you could actually have an influence or performance just by being allowed to write that stuff and literally highlighting it and going, don't shoot this. But this is actually what you were saying.
What had just happened seconds before.
You know, and I think you can do a lot of that.
I'm tempted to wrap this up with a mini exercise that I did not discuss with Stu beforehand, so it may be just for the benefit of our live listeners, is that Stu and I are currently co-writing a horror movie about city slicker backpackers going to a remote Australian farm.
Are you saying what we've written is folk horror, Jazz?
No, I don't think it's
needs
folk
more
horror.
folk music.
I don't think it's folk horror at all. And I think I want to draw this.
So city slicker Ukrainian backpackers?
Oh, not Ukrainian, all from all over. Backpackers in Australia, you know how to get their visa extended. They need to go and do rural service. So they go to this remote farm. And there definitely is the clash of cultures between the farming and the city. But I think importantly, in our story, the farm culture is still colonial white culture. It's a very different culture. It's a rural culture, but it's not, it would be a very different film if, say, they were like this film, anthropologists, let's say, going out into the outback and being in an indigenous community. Our film doesn't feel like folk horror because I feel like...
It totally could be though. Because it's not always about like going to an old or ancient pagan community. The trick with folk horror is isolated and has gone different to the main cultural stream.
We definitely have that.
Like and connection to nature. So again, like I think you can't have a folk horror that you know, you can have a folk horror that is set in a village, absolutely, but there still has to be like trees or water or like things where it feels like nature is kind of there and more present. But I don't think it has to be that you go to a rural country town and it's actually filled with pagan rituals. It can be a standard country town as long as something in that town has gone wrong and weird because of being cut out from the outside world.
And we have all those things.
Probably written a folk horror then, turns out.
Well, so I guess the distinction I'm trying to draw is definitely these city slicker backpackers experience culture shock from being part of this community that has been largely isolated from where culture has developed and evolved in cities as opposed to in rural Australia. Like, and we're talking quite rural Australia. This isn't even country town. Like, so, and there's definitely a lot of nature involved, but it is still like, I think because they're colonizers, because they're, you know, white Australian farmers who themselves dominated the land into their, it's like a clash of two different
but I think that's because you're working from the presumption there that the village in any of these scenarios that they go to is good, and that's not the case. Like
and that
the village that you go to doesn't have to be the original settlers or the original anything. It just has to be separate and different from the outside world. in a way that is interesting. So a good way to think about it is, how different would this film be if your backpackers, for whatever reason, all came from a similar rural country town? It would probably not work, because you wouldn't get the city slicker vibes. You wouldn't get, wow, we're an alien and we're kind of fish out of water. What's going on? What are these rituals in whatever form? Those things wouldn't work. So if that's true, if your film wouldn't be as effective if the backpackers were all country kids that were really familiar with farms and then turn up to this farm, then like you can see how it's so much about that kind of isolated rural location, and then the city coming in and not understanding that. Like that's a
sounds like we're writing folk horror, Stu.
I think there's definitely an element of it, because like having now only watched The Witch, but that feels like its own special class. The Wicker Man.
The Witch is horror, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because when we took a vote, my mum didn't want to watch either of them, and I was like, I actually think you'll like The Witch. Like, it's got horror elements, but if you're interested in literature, it felt like Gothic. What that's the strength of The Witch. It feels like Gothic literature of the time. But I think what is interesting, Chaz, about what we're doing is there is an element of that, because it's this own community that is literally bringing in. I mean, it feels like we're selling our concept, but the whole idea of the backpackers working on these Australian farms is that they're literally being sacrificed for the harvest. We paid them nothing because the locals don't want to do it, and we need blood of some kind, blood, sweat, and tears of someone in order to get the harvest out, so we can get $5 fucking avocados.
So we say, you want to stay in Australia, you have to do this.
And it's like, so therefore we do a sacrifice. And I think maybe if we lean into that slightly in a little bit of symbolism, it might be fun. And we should just have a character. The American character has to have like a fucking acoustic guitar and sing some bad folk music.
A banjo, man. A banjo.
But like folk doesn't have
a ukulele. All the cool chicks have ukuleles.
I think one of the mistakes with folk horror is people think that it folk music, which is probably where it started, but I would say the folk more refers to people, in the sense of it's the horror of people that have gone a bit wrong and have been isolated. And, you know, to your point, Chaz, about that it would be different if it was in an isolated community versus like you're kind of going to a community that's already the colonizers, is that there's something that Australians in particular are quite good at doing, which is going, this is our country, stay out, etc., etc., not remembering that only a few hundred years ago we came in. And so you can use recent immigrants that it's like, go back home, there's no jobs for you here, you're staying to extend your visa, but we don't really want you, to then comment on the fact that the farmer whose place they're on is also an immigrant and also a settler and also someone that fundamentally doesn't belong on that land. So, you know, I think that, we have
is Wake from...
Wake in Fright.
Wake in Fright. Would you say that's folk horror? I would say that's folk horror.
I would say it has elements of it. I mean, you know, going to isolated village and things go wrong. I mean, I have a bit of trouble with that as horror in general. I would put it weirdly in the thriller category sometimes, I think, because of the body count. But it's certainly got a lot of the or lack of body count. I think it does have a lot of elements of like there's kind of the pigs and the roos and like there's a lot of kind of
I feel like it was a psychological horror. Like it doesn't make you lean forward and go, ooh, what's the mystery that's trying to be resolved here? It's just a guy like being broken down by his environment.
I think there's some interesting discussion in here to kind of nail in a little bit the difference between horror and psychological horror. If you want to talk about
I don't know
broader screenwriting
difference all the time. I think some of it is just, you know it when you see it, which sucks. But like, you know, there are some films like Black Swan to me is not horror. It's psychological thriller, but with a few more deaths. It might be horror with, you know, and then.
So the deaths are a key part for you?
I think so. I would say it's a little bit like with a romance film. A rom-com isn't a rom-com unless they end up happy together at the end. And I don't think a horror film is a horror film unless someone dies.
I'm subtly different. I'm like, what does the film make you want to feel? And in Black Swan, I guess I lean more towards horror because it's not making me try to. There's definitely in Black Swan more than Wake in Fright. There is a mystery that's trying to be unraveled. Like, is the girl real or not? Like, that's much more of a thriller question.
Black Swan also lands on the side of she's not, and that it's all in her head, which I think the ending of Black Swan makes the rest of the film not horror, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I love Black Swan, to be very clear. But
I'm sure we all do. But like the moment when she's like peeling the skin from her fingers accidentally and stuff like that. There's moments in that film that just make you feel like horror, you know, and the same, like you're talking about the reshoot in Wake in Fright. I'm like, what is this film trying to do? Is it trying to thrill you, or is it trying to disgust you or make you feel afraid?
But I think like it is like, I think it's that in horror things have to happen that are irrevocable, that can't be changed, that you can't come back from. And that's that sense, like, you know, as I say, the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, no matter how well or not well the rest of her life goes, she can never come back from that day that she just had. Like she can never come back from it. And I think for me, like death is the ultimate thing you can't come back from. So it's really, I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm sure your lovely listeners will write in to be like, here's a horror film, no one dies. But I would say as a general rule, if you're writing a film and no one dies, it is probably a thriller. And if you're writing a film and people die, it is probably a horror film or closer to.
There is hybridization here that I think is actually a really good lesson, interestingly. And I want to point this out in the context of Midsommar. What's interesting about Black Swan is that they have taken a psychological thriller premise and they've elevated it. They've elevated it with body horror, right? All this stuff straight out of body horror. Midsommar, as is common with a lot of elevated horror or elevated genre films, is they've elevated it by mixing in drama. In the case of Midsommar, it's almost mumblecore. The way the performances and those character relationships are written, they're very much leaning into that mumblecore aspect, which I really like.
Even on the dual dialogue, I noted that when I was reading it. I'm like, I love how they kind of speak over each other in that way that feels like a conversation. And he does it, like dual dialogue is really annoying to do in Final Draft. He made a choice to put a bunch of things in dual dialogue.
Unless he was smart and used fade in, which has got way better dual dialogue.
Yeah.
You know, way better dual dialogue.
But even, or maybe it was to cut down on the page count. Who can say, Ari? I wouldn't judge you. I have done it before too.
Oh, but, but it shifts it into mumblecore. It's not just drama. Yeah. It's like we are leaning into a little bit of mumblecore. And interestingly, thrillers, like there is this argument that Silence of the Lambs is a horror film. And I don't necessarily believe that, but there's ways that they've kind of just added to the thriller.
Think of it as a horror film. Straight up, it's a horror film. And I think all of the people that didn't call it a horror film at the time because it won an Oscar were basically trying to say horror films can't win Oscars, so it's not a horror film. I think it's a horror film. Like, he peels the face off someone and puts it on his face. It's people die. It
happens to be Mark from Midsommar that he puts on.
I know, but Midsommar's a horror film. Whereas,
I know, I agree with you 100%. CS, but I actually think of Silence of the Lambs as more of a thriller just because it is like, it's about will the cop catch the criminal? Like that's what you're leaning into.
But that's interesting watching The Wicker Man, Chaz, and you haven't watched it, is it's got a cop premise. He's literally turning up in the remote. I'm watching it going, someone should option this and turn it into like a 6-part miniseries for Netflix. In some remote fucking island because because it's kind of setting into Scandi noir, and at the moment, like I'm sitting there looking at it going, "Fuck, it really would work," because that's that whole going into the strange place that which is what through all those.
The command is that too many things have now taken from it. Like Midsommar is why when Stu, when you asked me what you should watch before doing this, why I said Wicker Man is Midsommar is directly. Like the line is 1-to-1 and Ari has talked about how it's a love letter to Wicker Man.
But he's dropped the procedural storyline and focused on a more classic horror setup as her friends go away.
But I think it's hard to do it again now because what felt really interesting in the 70s feels really stayed now. You're like, oh, you're going to an isolated village. Oh, they're wearing masks. Oh, I wonder what will happen. Like,
when their heads pop up with like, and it's like, oh, we've seen this in so many other films. Like that,
because everything else took from it. Yeah.
So I think the broader observation I want to make, coming back, kind of circling back, is that Traz's observation about dread being a key part of Midsommar, whether or not it works for you, this idea that it's about dread. And I think that is part of that, what is a horror film feeling, is that feeling of dread. And it is something that Midsommar does very well. Everything is foreshadowed. It's not trying to be clever.
It tells you.
Thrill you.
I mean, as I say, I think the fact that they open with a mural where if you had paused on that mural and looked at it, you have just learned the plot of the film is one of the most baller things I've ever seen.
And which connects back to medieval kind of morality plays and the idea of the dumb play telling you what the film, or what the play is going to be about before showing you. It actually kind of connects it to melodrama, because I'm not sure if you listen to our melodrama thing, but the idea of what is the effect on people, that we're not as concerned with the ending as we are about the effect of what is happening. And Midsummer, and we talked about a little bit about the connection between horror and melodrama. This has definitely got a melodramatic element, as does The Wicker Man, because we know what the ending's going to be. Yeah. So it's not about
they don't live.
It's not about the twists. It's about the impact of being in this community and what this does to their relationships. And maybe one or two of them will live, but who will that be? And there is a possibility. I mean, I think we know it's going to be Danny, but there is also this possibility, because they want Christian seed, right, that it could be Christian that lives. Because if you're going to have a community where it's largely inbreeding, you're probably going to get a more genetic pool by a guy that can have impregnate 5 women rather than one woman that's going to have like 5 babies.
I think the thing is, like, I was less concerned about if Danny would live. I wanted her to, but I was less concerned about if Danny would live than I was about making sure that Christian died. That was more important to me.
That was the right attitude.
Ruthless.
Yeah.
Any kind of final observations, like in terms of screenwriting lessons? Because we've had a very great meandering discussion.
Maybe not as much about folk horror as I had hoped. I'm sorry, everyone. But I just want to talk about script as well. Midsommar's a great film. I guess.
I mean, we can, like, if there's like a key folk horror elements, like just say, because sometimes strengthening plot, coming back to the workshopping idea, right? That I look at it and go, maybe leaning into folk horror will make our script, because ours is like borderline thriller. Like there's other than the body count, right? Because it's a bit like The Invitation. Is The Invitation a horror film?
Yes.
How do we lean into that? And it could be that, I don't know, what do we do to lean into folk horror elements? Catherine?
Well, the rural setting is always really important. I think the sense of isolation, and again, in these post-COVID times, it's kind of trying to pin down, like, a lot of people have been posting that humorous thing that has that little bit of truth in it, like, oh, I should just go into the country and buy a giant property and have a commune, because we're so stuck in our houses and isolated. And in the city, like, I'm close to my neighbors, but I'm also not, like, I have no idea who they are, but I'm like 20 meters away from them. So that whole sense is definitely, I think, causing a lot of people to, type the tweet that says, oh, I should just move to the country and do the thing. But then I have a lot of friends that grew up in the country that was like, I could not wait to get out. Like, it's isolated, it's bigoted, it's awful. And so I think we idealize rural settings as being more real and a return to nature, and more respectful. And look, they're good in some ways, but they also come with dark sides and weird cultural things that can start to happen. So
I think whenever we haven't even finished the first draft yet, Catherine, but whenever we've actually spent some time putting ourselves in the perspective of the farmers and go, like, how shit it is that they have to use government subsidized foreign labor just to feed city slickers at like supermarket subsidized prices, and that they're having their livelihood squeezed. Like, as soon as you kind of get into that point of view, you're like, yeah, you know what? These guys have been screwed over as well. And it's not tied so much to nature as it is tied to a way of life, but a rural way of life.
That is kind of, I think, but nature and rural way of life, like, obviously it's not identical, but as I say, I don't think you could write a folk horror if you said you've got your exchange, your immigrants that have to go work, and they had to go work in a outer suburban supermarket. I don't think that would work. That just wouldn't fit enough of the feelings, which is like, oh, it's about the city and returning to nature and isolation. And that just, even though it hits a lot of the same beats, it just wouldn't feel the same.
You haven't spent enough time in sunshine.
Yeah, I have. I worked out there for 9 months. I know sunshine. But yeah, I mean, like, this film, this village in the middle of, a capital Swedish city would not have worked. Like, it just wouldn't have been the same. So I think there are some elements that are essential. Like,
okay, broader observation about Australian landscape, which is obviously we got more than just Australian listeners. I can't remember who it was, possibly Stephen Cleary, talking about the problems with Australians making films. Is from his perspective, and he's coming from as someone who works in Europe and stuff like that, is that essentially our cities could be cosmopolitan cities anywhere in the world, plus we speak English, right? And so what is interesting about Australian cinema, if there was to be an Australian cinema, is that it's about our relationship with the landscape and the landscape and our relationship with the indigenous kind of population, like the particularities of our colonization.
Mhm.
And yet, and it's interesting that the films that seem to resonate overseas are the show, or the shows are what deal with that. And so it feels like folk horror as a form is something that can tap into our relationship with the landscape, with the rural, with the sense of alienation and the isolation. Like, I can't remember, one of the projects I'm working on has got stuff like, there's a town called Portland in Victoria, whale settlement from like 1820, the first settlement in Victoria outside. And it's like, would be like 6 days ride from Melbourne at that time. You're like, you're fucking isolated, right? That place would be miserable. Great opportunity to tell kind of like a horror story there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is we have a unique relationship with landscape, and also we can't do that rural English village story quite in the same way. Like we do have,
we don't have the
small
history.
villages. Yeah, we don't have the history and that sense of like everyone being in your business and, oh, that family's been here for 300 years. Like, you know, obviously there are families that have been here for hundreds of years, but they're not in that kind of judgmental small village setting, which is so essential to like that kind of very English style of murder mystery, let's say. But we do have landscape where you can get utterly lost and no one will ever find you. And that's and a very alien landscape. So I think that's why we have such a, I mean, I talk about landscape in horror, Australian horror, all the time. We have a very particular relationship with it, I think. Cool.
Any other observations? Final wrap up. Chaz?
No, I appreciate, CS, the time that you've taken, because I think I now like Midsummer more, having spoken to you about it, than
and like
partially,
Christian less. That's the main thing.
Yeah, well, I'm just secretly worried. Am I Christian? I'm just gonna
All men
check
should be
my
worried
gaslighting credentials.
Well,
We'll
I mean,
find out when we
as I
play
say,
Dead of Winter tonight, Chaz.
I enjoyed it more the second time round. Also, when I wasn't as tense watching the film, because I was so tense the first time that I feel like the second and third time I actually had a chance to appreciate the film for what it was doing, versus waiting for the standard horror beats, which in this film come, but in really unexpected ways. So,
cool.
Yeah.
All right. Final opportunity for back matter. I don't think we got a lot of audience, yet alone audience questions. So why people, if they write to us, I'm mainly looking at you, Julio. Want to thank our Draft Zero interns, Chris Walker and Alexa Brunjet, and our patrons, Chris Walker, same Chris Walker, who both helps us and is a patron, Jack Smith, Jesse, Crob, Mateo, Sandra, and Theus. And thank you to everyone that has continued to be a supporter during these hard times. Thanks to Nick MacArthur, who wrote to us very kindly and saying, look, COVID's fucked him up and he can't support us at the moment. Thank you so much for your long time support. It's amazing that anyone gives us any money to rant. And thanks to anyone who's also joined up recently to help get you more Draft Zero more often. Any final questions? Anyone? Bueller? I'm just going to get my dad is going to send me like a long stream messages after this.
Yeah. One of the best things.
My mum gave me notes the last panel I did. She was listening to it in a different room and she came in and was like, I have some thoughts.
Stu's dad's
That's exactly
texts
what I get.
after the live streams are just the best.
He basically gives notes. He'll give like a mark. Teacher note, right? This is great. This is what you can improve. This is good. This is what you can improve. This was good.
Yeah, that's
I'll
what
give you 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
Folk horror.
It's very scary. Don't go into the country. That's what the lesson is here, everyone.
That is the lesson. All right. How do I stop live